For 3 years she set 2 plates at the table, then put one back. For 3 years she stood on that porch watching the road, waiting for someone, anyone, to come check on her. No one did. Then a flood came and nearly took everything she had left. She was drowning in brown water, rope cutting her hands to the bone, cattle being swept away. When a stranger appeared on the ridge, he didn't say, "Are you all right?" He didn't say, "Let me help." He looked at her bleeding hands, looked at her land, and said 5 words that broke her wide open. But the secret he was carrying, it could destroy them both. This story will remind you that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fight or run. It's show up, stay, and let someone see you as you truly are. Welcome to Wild West Stories, where the frontier speaks through tales of forgotten souls, second chances, love that's built with scarred hands, and the quiet heroism of simply choosing to stay. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.
The rope tore free from Grace Holloway's hands at the exact moment she realized no one on earth knew she was drowning. She went down hard. Her knees hit the creek bed and the brown water closed over her shoulders. Cold, so cold it stole the breath right out of her chest. The hemp had shredded her palms on its way out, and she could see the pink of raw flesh through the mud and blood before the current swirled it all together into something the color of rust. The heifer was gone. Swept downstream, bawling, eyes rolling white. Grace pushed herself up, coughing, the water at her thighs now and rising. Her skirt dragged heavy against her legs. Every step felt like pulling free from a hand that wanted to hold her under. 28 head of cattle. That is what she had left. 30 that morning, but the creek had already taken 2. She could hear them somewhere downstream, or maybe she was imagining it. Hard to tell with the rain hammering so loud it turned the whole valley into a drum. 28 head, lose them and she lost the farm. Lose the farm and 3 years of surviving alone out here became 3 years of nothing. 3 years of waking before dawn and falling asleep after dark. Of mending fence with bleeding hands and pulling calves in the mud, and eating beans standing up because sitting down at that table alone made her chest ache in a way she could not name. 3 years of all that. And for what? For a piece of paper with her dead husband's name on it, and a herd of cattle that did not care if she lived or died. Thomas had been gone 3 years come December. Winter fever took him. Quick, at least. He went to bed with a cough on a Tuesday and did not wake up Thursday morning. The neighbors came for the funeral. Every last one of them. They filled her kitchen with covered dishes and casseroles and pies she could not eat. They said the right things. Every single one of them said the same 7 words. If you need anything, just ask. Grace had waited. She had truly believed them. For 7 months she set 2 plates at every meal out of habit, then put one back. She stood on the porch and watched the road, expecting someone to ride up, check on her, ask if the fence needed mending or the hay needed cutting, or if she just needed another human being to sit across from her and drink coffee without saying a word. Nobody came. Not one. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. And one morning Grace woke up and realized she had been a fool. She stopped setting out 2 plates, stopped watching the road, stopped expecting anything from anyone. She had been invisible before Thomas died. She just had not known it. But right now, in this brown water with rain hammering her skull, none of that mattered. What mattered was the rope trailing off the next steer, 20 feet to her left, and whether she could reach it before the current took him too. Grace lunged. Her boots slipped on the creek bottom. She caught the rope, wrapped it twice around her right hand, even though the hemp burned like fire against her torn palm. The steer lurched. Grace held on. She leaned into the current and started pulling 1 step at a time toward the high ground where the cabin sat dry and empty on the hill. Her teeth chattered so hard she could hear them over the rain. She clamped her jaw shut, kept moving. That is when she heard it. Through the rain, through the wind, through the sound of her own ragged breathing. Hoofbeats. Grace looked up. Water ran into her eyes and blurred everything to gray and brown. But she could see the ridge, 200 yards upslope, where the grass was still green and the ground was still dry. A man sat on a sorrel mare, just sat there, still as a fence post, hat pulled low, rain streaming off the brim in thin silver lines, saddlebags heavy on both sides. She waited for him to ride on. Everybody always did. He swung down from the saddle. Grace watched him tie the mare to a scrub oak, watched him start down the slope toward her. His oilskin duster was dark with rain, plastered to his legs. He moved steady, not rushing, not hesitating, just walking toward her like he had somewhere to be, and it happened to be right here. 50 yards, 40. His boots squelched in the saturated ground. 30 yards. She could make out his face now. Weathered, dark stubble along his jaw. Eyes that did not look away when she met them. He stepped into the water like he belonged there. Stopped about 6 feet from her. Close enough that she could smell horse sweat and leather and days on the trail. He did not say, "Are you all right?" Did not say, "Let me help." Did not say, "What happened here?" or "You poor thing," or any of the useless words people say when they want to feel good about themselves without actually doing anything. He looked at the cattle milling in the rising water, looked at her hands still bleeding, still gripping the rope. Then he looked at her face, held her eyes for one long second. "Where is your place?" he said. His voice was quiet, rough from disuse, like a man who had gone days without talking to anyone. Grace pointed upslope with her chin. The cabin sat high on the hill, log walls, stone chimney, barely visible through sheets of rain. He looked at it, long look, then at the cattle, then at her hands. He nodded once. "Best save what is yours, then." 5 words. That was all. And then he moved to the nearest heifer, grabbed the trailing rope she could not reach, and started walking uphill. The heifer followed him like she had been waiting for someone who knew what he was doing. Grace stood there, water to her thighs, rain hammering her shoulders, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. He was already halfway up the hill. She grabbed another rope, pulled. The steer lurched forward. Together they slogged through the mud. Her hands left red streaks on the hemp. They worked until dark. Back and forth through the rising water. He never spoke, never complained, never stopped. Every time Grace dragged one animal to high ground and turned around, he was already coming back with 2 more. His hands worked the knots quick and sure. Someone who had done this 10,000 times. By the time full dark fell, the sky gone black except when lightning flickered. They had 28 head on the upper pasture. Grace could hear them shifting and lowing in the darkness. Alive. Safe. She stood on the porch, dripping, shaking from cold and exhaustion she could feel in her bones. The stranger stood beside her, just as wet, just as tired, still holding a coil of wire and a hammer, like he was not sure where to put them down. Grace looked out at the valley. Gone. Just brown water stretching across where her pasture used to be. Lightning flickered and the water reflected it back, silver on brown. The barn was half submerged. She could see the peak of the roof. The rest was swallowed. The road, the bridge. Everything below the house was gone under. He should leave. But the road would not be passable for days, maybe a week. Neither of them said this. Grace reached for the cabin door, opened it. Lamplight spilled out warm and gold. She had left it burning that morning. Warm air hit her face. "There is coffee," she said. He followed her inside. The door closed behind them. Grace did not ask his name. She was afraid that if she did, he would remember he was a stranger and leave. Bo Ryder. That was the name he had borrowed 5 years ago from a dead man's gravestone outside Abilene. He had not planned to stop at this farm, had not planned to stop anywhere. But the woman's bleeding hands made his horse refuse to walk on, and Bo had learned a long time ago not to argue with a mare who had made up her mind. Now he stood in a stranger's cabin, dripping mud water onto her floor. and wondered what in the hell he was still doing here. They ate cold bread standing in the kitchen, soaked through, not speaking. Two strangers dripping on the same floor with nothing between them but lamplight and the sound of rain on the roof. Grace insisted he take the bed. She would sleep on the pallet by the stove, she said. Her voice left no room for argument. Bo had known women like this. Women made of wire and silence and the kind of stubbornness that could keep a person alive or kill them, depending on which way the wind blew. He lay in the dark, listening to the rain, and trying not to think about how this cabin felt. Because it felt like his mother's place in Missouri. Same size, same low ceiling, same smell of wood smoke and lye soap and something older, something that got into the walls after years of the same person living alone inside them. Loneliness had a smell. Bo knew it. He had carried it on his own skin for 5 years. He recognized the woman's expression, too. The flat eyes, the jaw set against expecting anything. He had seen that look in every mirror and every creek reflection for half a decade. It was the face of someone who had stopped waiting for anything good to happen. Not angry, not sad, just done. Dawn came gray through the window. Bo was outside before Grace woke, walking the fence line in the upper pasture, checking posts, testing each one with his hand. The flood had done damage, but the ground up here was solid, good soil. Whoever built this place had known where to put things. When he came back inside, Grace was at the stove. The kindling had caught and she was adding split logs. A blue enamel coffee pot sat on the hottest part of the stove top, chipped at the spout. Handle wrapped with wire where it had broken 2 winters back. The coffee was real. He could smell it as it heated. Rich and dark and almost painful in how good it was. She was using her emergency supply. He understood what that meant. She had been saving it for something worth saving it for and had decided this counted. She set 2 tin cups on the table, then stopped, stared at them. 2 cups. Her hand hovered over the second one like she might take it back. Then she left it. Bo came in, scraped his boots on the door frame, stepped inside. "Fences are down," he said. "Wire tangled in the current. Half the posts are gone." Grace poured coffee into both cups, handed him one. He wrapped both hands around it. Did not drink yet, just held it, letting the heat soak into his palms. They stood there with steam rising between them. Grace took a sip, burned her tongue, did not care. Bo drank, closed his eyes for just a second. "Sit," Grace said. They sat at the table. The wood was scarred from years of use, knife marks, water rings, a burn mark from a hot pan set down without thinking. 12 years of meals eaten at this table. Bo ran his thumb along a groove in the surface and knew without being told that the man who built it was dead. Grace was struggling with the pump handle when Bo noticed her hands. She gripped the iron, pulled down. Pain crossed her face, sharp and quick. She bit the inside of her cheek and pulled again. Bo set down his coffee. Crossed the room. Not fast, just steady. Grace kept pumping. Did not look at him. He reached out and took her wrist, gentle, careful. Turned her hand palm up. The rope burns were bad, angry red. Some of the skin peeling back, others weeping clear fluid. Dirt ground deep into the raw places. "These need tending," he said, not a question. Grace started to pull her hand back. He held on. Not tight, just firm enough that she would have to jerk away to break free. "Sit," he said. He pulled one of the wooden chairs out. The legs scraped against the floor. Grace sat, her hands still in his. He found her medicine tin on the shelf above the wash basin. Black japanned metal with faded red flowers on the lid. Inside, a small brown bottle of carbolic and some clean rags torn into strips. Bo heated water in the kettle. Not boiling, just warm enough. He poured some into a clean bowl, added a few drops of carbolic. The sharp medicinal smell filled the room, biting, making her eyes water. He brought the bowl to the table, sat across from her. "Hand," he said. Grace extended her right hand. He took it, dipped a rag in the carbolic water, wrung it out, pressed it to her palm. The sting was immediate and fierce. Grace sucked in a breath through her teeth. Did not make another sound, just gripped the edge of the table with her other hand. Bo worked slow, cleaning the torn skin. The rag came away brown with dirt and dried blood. He rinsed it. Did it again. The water in the bowl turned cloudy. Grace watched his face, weathered from years in the sun, lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting, stubble dark along his jaw. His hands were scarred, white lines across the knuckles, a puckered place on his thumb where something had bit deep once. Calluses thick on his palms from years of holding reins and rope and tools. But his touch was careful, deliberate. He did not press too hard on the raw places. When her right hand was clean, he started on the left. This one was worse. The rope had gone deeper. One of the burns crossed her lifeline. The skin had split open. He cleaned it the same way. Patient, thorough, not rushing. He tore an old sheet into strips, long strips. The fabric gave with a soft ripping sound. He took her right hand again, laid the linen across her palm, wrapped it around, over and under between her thumb and fingers. Not too tight, not too loose. Tied it off at her wrist, tucked the end in. Did the same with her left. When he was done, both her hands were wrapped in white linen. Clean, protected. Should have done this last night, he said. Quiet. Grace looked at her bandaged hands, flexed her fingers. The linen pulled but did not restrict. Ain't nobody here to see them, she said. The words came out flat, matter of fact. She was not looking for pity, just stating truth. Bo set down the remaining linen, looked at her. I see them, he said. The stove ticked in the silence. Outside, one of the cows lowed, low and mournful. Then Bo reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a pencil stub, set it on the table. From his other pocket, an old envelope, already written on. Someone's name and an address crossed out. He turned it over to the blank side. What needs fixing first, he asked. They went through the list. His handwriting was careful, even, slanted slightly to the right. Someone had taught him to write slow and neat, someone patient. Fence, Grace said. Cattle will wander without it. He wrote fence, barn. Half of it is gone. He wrote barn, assess damage. The cow needs shelter, lean-to for cow, tools got washed out. Lost most of them. He paused, pencil hovering. What did you save, Grace asked. Hammer, wire, harnesses. He wrote inventory tools, then underneath in the same careful hand, salvage what we can. That word sat there on the envelope, we. Grace felt it settle in her chest. Heavy, strange. She did not remark on it, neither did he. After she was asleep that night, Bo went to his saddlebags. He unbuckled the leather flap and reached inside. His hand found the pistol first, wrapped in oilcloth. Then a folded paper underneath it, face down. Then an old letter, yellowed, addressed in a woman's handwriting to a farm in Independence, Missouri. His mother's handwriting. His mother's farm. The only proof he had ever belonged anywhere. He pushed everything deeper into the bottom of the bag, buckled it shut. His hands were shaking. Grace had asked where he was from earlier that evening. Nowhere special, Bo had said. It was the most honest answer he had ever given. And the biggest lie. The barn went down at dawn. It sounded like a rifle shot. One crack, then the whole world folding in on itself. Grace was on her feet and out the door before the echo died. Barefoot on the porch boards, cold biting her soles. She ran toward the sound, bare feet in mud, chickens scattering around her in a flurry of squawking wings. It happened slow. The ridgepole bowing, sagging in the middle like a broken back, the walls tilting inward, another crack, sharper this time, loud as a second rifle shot. The whole structure folded, roof collapsing into itself, walls buckling outward, then falling in. The sound of it rolled across the valley, crash and splinter and the low rumble of timber settling into mud. Dust rose, brown and thick, hanging in the still morning air. Grace stood frozen halfway between the porch and the chicken coop. Inside that barn was everything. Her husband's tools. The hammer with the hickory handle he had shaped himself. The saw. The planer. The level his father had given them on their wedding day. All of it. Winter hay, bales stacked careful in the loft. Timothy and clover, cut in July. Enough to feed the herd through till spring. Seed grain, wheat in burlap sacks for planting when the ground thawed. For next year. For surviving. All of it gone. Bo came out of the lean-to they had built for the cow the day before. He started toward the wreckage, moving fast. Then he stopped. Stood there looking at the broken timbers and the twisted metal roof and the brown water still lapping at the foundation. He did not say it would be all right. Did not say they could rebuild. Did not offer any of the hollow words people throw at grief to make themselves feel useful. He just stood there for a long time, and Grace saw something on his face she recognized. The expression of a man who had lost everything before, and knew that no words helped. Then he walked to the porch, sat down on the step, looked at her. "Tell me about that barn," he said. Grace stared at him. "The barn." He said it again. "Tell me about it." So she did, not because she wanted sympathy, because for the first time in 3 years someone asked. She told him about Thomas cutting the timber himself, dragging it in with the mule, how it took him a whole summer to raise the frame, how she held the beams while he nailed them because they could not afford help. How the hickory-handled hammer was the first thing he bought when they arrived in Kansas, before the plow, before the seed, before the cook stove. Because a man needs a hammer before he needs anything else. That is what Thomas said. Bo listened, did not interrupt. When she finished, he took the envelope from his pocket, the one with their list. He crossed out the old items with long strokes through the middle. Barn repair, seed wheat, winter hay storage, all of them gone. Then he started a new list below. Smaller, possible, lean-to for cow, finish. Cut grass, low pasture when water clears, move herd down, fence, patch what we can. Chickens, move coop higher, firewood, winter coming. He slid the envelope across to her. Smaller, he said. But we can do it. Grace read it twice. Her throat was tight, but the pressure in her chest had eased some. She picked up the pencil and added one more item at the bottom, in her own handwriting. Not as neat as his. Shakier. Heifer's leg, change bandage. She set the pencil down. "All right," she said, and that was that. Later that morning, Grace told Bo something that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the flood. Last fall, she said, a man named Hank Dawson rode out to the farm. Big rancher, biggest in the county. County commissioner, too. He had been polite. Offered to buy her land. Good price, he said. Fair deal. A woman alone out here, it is dangerous. Grace had told him no. She was not selling. Dawson had smiled, tipped his hat, and ridden away. Since then, 3 other small homesteads in the area had sold. The Millers, the Carpenters, the Wainwrights. All of them to Dawson. All of them gone. Grace was the last one. Bo listened to this without expression. But something shifted behind his eyes. A sharpening, like a man who had just been handed a piece of a puzzle he did not know he was working. That afternoon, Bo walked the fence line alone. Most of the damage was what you would expect from a flood. Posts snapped by the force of the water. Wire tangled and stretched, caught up with brush and debris. Nature's mess. Random. Ugly. But at the southwest corner where the fence met the creek bed, Bo stopped. He crouched down. The wire here was different, not torn, not stretched, not tangled with flood debris. It was cut. 3 strands, clean, even. The kind of cut that came from wire cutters, not from water. Bo ran his thumb along the edge, smooth, deliberate. Someone had cut Grace's fence before the flood, before the storm. The cattle that wandered into the low pasture and nearly drowned had not just wandered. They had been given a path. Bo stood up, looked south toward where Grace had said Dawson's ranch lay. Then he looked north toward the cabin on the hill where Grace was inside making cornbread with flour she could not afford to waste. He did not tell her, not yet. He did not know this territory, did not know who to trust, did not know if the person who cut the wire was Dawson, or someone working for Dawson, or someone else entirely. But he restrung the wire himself, tight and true, and that night he slept on the porch with his pistol within arm's reach. 3 layers of knowing now. The reader knows the fence was cut. Bo knows the fence was cut. Grace does not know. And somewhere in the dark, the person who cut it was waiting for results. That night, Grace fell asleep for the first time in 3 years, knowing someone would still be there come morning. In the dark, on the other side of the cabin wall, Bo lay awake, turning a question over and over. Who cuts a widow's fence line before a storm? And why? Bo rode into Burr Oak at noon, and the first thing he saw was his own face, 5 years younger, sketched in cheap ink, nailed to the post office wall. Wanted. Elijah Kane, murder, Silas Dawson, Jackson County, Missouri, 1873, $200 reward. The poster was old, sun faded. The paper had gone yellow and the ink had bled at the edges where rain had touched it over the years. But it had been recently re-nailed. Fresh tack, bright copper heads against the weathered wood. Someone had dug this poster up from wherever it had been gathering dust and put it back where people could see it. And the person who nailed it was still there. A boy, 17 maybe, tall and thin with dark hair and a jaw that had not quite finished growing into a man's face. He stood at the feed store wall 10 feet away, hammer in one hand, a bag of tacks in the other, halfway through nailing up another copy of the same poster. He had a stack of them tucked under his arm. 5 or 6 at least. The boy turned, saw Bo standing in the street, staring. Their eyes met. The boy looked at the poster on the post office wall, then back at Bo. The resemblance was plain. 5 years older, 20 pounds lighter, more weathered by sun and wind and the particular kind of wear that comes from sleeping on the ground and eating when you can. But the jaw was the same. The eyes were the same. The boy did not speak. He set down the hammer, picked up his remaining posters, turned and walked away down the street. Did not look back, did not run. Just walked, steady, like a person who had decided something, but had not quite figured out what it meant yet. Bo watched him go. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. He should ride west. Right now. This minute. Get on the mare and put 50 miles between himself and this town before sundown. He had done it 17 times before in 5 years. It was the one thing he was good at, leaving. But in his saddlebag was a list. Flour, coffee, beans, salt, apples if the price was not too high. And in his shirt pocket was a small cloth pouch heavy with coins. All the money Grace Holloway had left in the world. She had given it to him that morning. Her hand had shaken when she set it on the table. But her voice had not. She trusted him with everything she had. Bo tied the mare to the rail outside the general store and went inside. The store was dark after the bright street. It smelled of burlap and pickle brine and coal oil. A woman stood behind the counter, 50-ish, broad-shouldered, with gray streaked hair pulled back tight, and a face that looked like it had seen everything at least twice and was not impressed by any of it. Lena Marsh. Her name was painted on the sign outside in letters that were faded but still readable. Marsh General Goods. Dry goods, hardware, and sundries. Bo put his list on the counter. The woman looked at it, looked at him. "You are not from around here," she said. "No, ma'am." She started pulling items from the shelves. Flour, coffee, a small bag of dried beans, salt in a paper twist. "Who are you buying for?" she asked. "Casual." But her eyes were sharp. Bo hesitated, then said it. "Grace Holloway." The woman's hand stopped moving. She set down the tin of coffee she was holding and stared at him. "Grace Holloway," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. I am working her place." Lena Marsh's face did something complicated. Surprise first, Then relief, then something harder, something that looked like guilt. "She's alive," Lena said. It was not a question, but it needed answering anyway. "Yes, ma'am. She is." "I wrote her a letter," Lena said, 2 years ago, after her husband passed. "I wrote her a letter and told her if she needed anything, my door was open. She never wrote back. I figured she had moved on. Or—" She did not finish the sentence. The or hung in the air between them like smoke. "She is still there," Bo said. "Still working the place. By herself." Lena looked at him for a long time. Then she turned back to the shelves and started adding things to his order that were not on the list. Extra coffee, dried beef, a dozen small red apples, a twist of hard candy. She wrapped everything in brown paper and twine. "You tell her Lena Marsh has not forgotten her," she said. Her voice was fierce. "You tell her that." Bo nodded. He reached for the money pouch, but Lena shook her head. "Not for all of it," she said. "Half. Call it a debt I owe." The bell above the door rang. Bo did not need to turn around to know who had walked in. He felt it the way you feel a change in weather. The air got heavier. Hank Dawson was a big man, well-dressed for cattle country, clean boots, clean. Silver watch chain across his vest. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dark, and then he saw Bo. Their eyes met. Dawson looked at him the way a man looks at a horse he is thinking about buying. Slow, cold, assessing. "You are working the Holloway place," Dawson said. "Not a question." "I am," Bo said. Dawson moved further into the store. He picked up an apple from the barrel near the counter, turned it in his hand. "That land has been neglected 3 years," he said. His voice was pleasant, conversational, hard for a woman alone. He bit into the apple, chewed. Harder still with the drifter doing day work. Bo said nothing, paid for his goods, gathered his packages, walked past Dawson to the door. Dawson spoke again as Bo reached the threshold, just loud enough. "I always take care of my neighbors," Dawson said, one way or another. Bo did not respond. He walked to his horse, loaded the saddlebags, and swung up into the saddle. His hands were shaking. He gripped the reins hard to make them stop. On the road out of town, 1/2 mile past the last building, Bo pulled the mare to a stop. He reached inside his coat and took out the poster he had pulled off the post office wall. He had torn it down when no one was looking, folded it, and shoved it inside his shirt. He unfolded it now, looked at the sketch of his own face, read the name underneath. Elijah Kane, murder, Silas Dawson, Dawson. The same last name, the same cold eyes. Hank Dawson was the dead man's brother, and Bo had just walked into his territory and announced himself. He sat on the mare in the middle of the road, the poster in his hands, the wind picking up from the west. He could be across the state line by morning. He had done it before. 17 times. He was good at this, the best. Nobody left a place faster or more completely than Bo Ryder. But in his saddlebag was a pound of coffee for a woman who had been saving her last emergency tin for 3 years, waiting for something worth using it on. Bo folded the poster, put it back inside his coat, turned the horse east, toward the farm on the hill. He had 17 chances to ride away in 5 years. He took every single one. He did not know why this time was different, only that his horse was pointed toward something instead of away from it. And for the first time in 5 years, that felt like the right direction. By the second week, Grace caught herself listening for Bo's hammer the way a person listens for a heartbeat. Not because she needed to hear it, but because she was terrified it might stop. The days had taken on a rhythm. She would wake before dawn, light the stove, put the coffee on. By the time it was ready, Bo would be coming in from the morning check of the fence line and the cattle. They would drink coffee at the table without saying much. 2 cups, always 2 cups now. Grace did not think about it anymore, did not stare at the second cup, or wonder when it had become natural. It just was. Then the work. And there was always work. The flood had left a mess that would take months to untangle, but each day the list on the envelope got shorter. Bo worked steady and thorough. Not fast, not slow, just constant. Like a clock that did not know how to stop ticking. He rebuilt the lean-to for the milk cow. Not a temporary shelter this time, but a proper structure with a frame of peeled logs and a roof of split shingles. He salvaged nails from the barn wreckage, pulling them from broken boards and straightening them on a rock. He patched the fence post by post, splicing wire with his bare hands until his fingers were cross-hatched with thin red cuts. Grace worked beside him, mucking the lean-to, checking the cattle for injuries, walking the herd down to the low pasture as the water receded, watching them spread out across the recovering grass. She baked. Not survival bread anymore, real food. Real. Cornbread with the last of the lard, bean soup with dried beef from Lena's store. And one morning, without quite knowing why, she took down the jar of cinnamon from the high shelf. It had been there 3 years, nearly empty. Saving it for what, she had never known. This, maybe. She made a pie. Apples from the ones Bo had brought back from town, small and red. Cinnamon. Lard crust worked with her fingertips until it came together. She rolled it out on the table. The dough tore in one place and she patched it, pressed the edges back together, lined the cast iron skillet, filled it with the apples and cinnamon, cut strips for the lattice top. Her hands remembered how, even though it had been so long. The smell started almost right away, sweet and warm, filling the whole cabin, drifting out through the cracks in the door. Outside, the steady sound of hammer on nail stopped. Grace heard Bo at the pump, the handle squeaking, water splashing. He was washing the sawdust and sweat off. Getting clean. The door opened. He came in. His shirt was damp with sweat despite the cold outside. His hands smelled like pine sap and fresh-cut wood. He saw the pie on the windowsill. Stopped. "Pie," Grace said. He crossed to the window, looked down at it. The crust golden brown, the apples dark with cinnamon showing through the lattice. "When was the last time you made pie?" he asked. Grace did not answer, just set 2 plates on the table, 2 forks. She cut 2 pieces, gave him the bigger one. They sat. Neither talked. The forks scraped against the tin plates. Grace tasted cinnamon and apples and lard crust that was flaky and rich. Better than she remembered. Better than she had dared to hope. Bo set down his fork, looked at his empty plate, then at her. "Best pie I have had in 10 years, he said. Grace shrugged. "Just apples and lard." He shook his head. Did not say more. Did not need to. They sat there in the afternoon light slanting through the window, warming the table between them, and Grace felt something she had not felt in so long she almost did not recognize it. Content. Not happy, exactly. Content. The absence of dread. That evening they sat on the porch. The sky was clear for the first time in over a week. No clouds. Just color spreading across the prairie, orange and gold, the grass catching the light and turning it to fire. Bo sat on the top step. Grace sat beside him, close enough that when the wind shifted, their shoulders touched. Neither pulled away. She wanted to ask him things. Where he had been for 5 years. What he was carrying in those saddlebags that made his face go tight whenever he opened them. Why his hands shook sometimes when he thought she was not looking. But asking meant answers, and answers might mean he would leave. So she kept quiet and let the silence do what silence does best. Hold the space for what is not yet ready to be said. Bo told her about his mother that night, not everything, but some. How she died while he was away. Consumption. Nobody wrote to tell him. How he came home to find the farm sold, his mother's grave fresh in the churchyard, his brother gone west without leaving word. How he took what he could carry in a bedroll and walked away. Her dishes, the rocking chair, the quilt she had made, left behind. "I told myself it did not matter," he said. His voice was quiet, rough at the edges. "Told myself I was better off moving. Cannot miss what you do not stay around to lose." Grace listened, did not interrupt. She knew this language. She spoke it fluently. How long, she asked. 5 years. Long pause. The wind died down. Stars were coming out, thick and white across the Kansas sky. After Thomas died, Grace said, I waited. Neighbors came for the funeral, said all the right things. If you need anything, just ask. That is what they said. Every single one. She stopped. Her throat wanted to close. She forced the words past it. I waited. Thought they meant it. Thought someone would come check, see if I needed help. Days went by, then weeks. I would stand on the porch, watch the road. Kept thinking tomorrow they will come tomorrow. They are just busy. Everyone has their own work. Nobody came. Weeks turned into months. And I realized. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat. I realized I did not matter to nobody. Never did. I was just there. And when I was not there no more, nobody noticed or cared. She could not look at him. I was thinking about selling, she said, before the flood, just packing up and going. No reason left to hold on. Bo looked at her. The porch rail. The land spreading dark in every direction. The cabin behind them with its lamplight in the window. Best save what is yours, then, he said. Same 5 words, but different now. In the floodwater, they had meant cattle and survival. Here, in the quiet dark with stars overhead and their shoulders touching, they meant something else. The right to exist. The right to take up space in the world. The right to matter, even if nobody else said so. Grace felt tears on her face. She did not know when they had started. She wiped them with the back of her bandaged hand. Their shoulders pressed together. Neither moved apart. Then something caught Grace's eye. To the south. A glow on the horizon. Low and steady. Not lightning. Too orange for that. Too constant. What is that, she said. Bo stood. Walked to the edge of the porch. Looked south for a long time. Fire, he said. Morning brought the news. A passing rider on his way north stopped to water his horse at Grace's pump and told them what he knew. The Miller homestead, 3 miles south, burned in the night. Barn first, then the house. The whole place gone by dawn. Were they hurt? Grace asked. The rider shook his head. No, just scared enough. They signed their land over to Hank Dawson before breakfast. The rider said it like he was reporting the weather. Like this was just something that happened out here. After he left, Grace and Bo stood on the porch looking south. The smoke was still visible, a gray smudge against the autumn blue. Grace spoke without looking at Bo. I am the last one, she said. Bo did not answer. But that night he slept on the porch with his pistol across his lap. And when Grace reached for his hand as she brought him coffee in the morning dark, her fingers brushing his torn palm, neither of them pulled away. 20 miles south in Burr Oak, in the back office of the County Commission building, Hank Dawson sat at his desk reading a letter. It had come from the Jackson County Marshal's office in Missouri. The handwriting was neat. Official, Elijah Kane. Warrant still active. Confirm suspect location and we will arrange transport. Dawson folded the letter, put it in his vest pocket, and smiled. Monday morning, Grace found 2 steers loose with their tether ropes cut clean. Not broken, not chewed through. Cut. The same clean line she had seen Bo examining on the fence wire 2 weeks ago. Tuesday afternoon, the water trough tasted like copper. The cattle would not drink from it. Grace dumped it, scrubbed it, filled it fresh. By evening, it tasted wrong again. Wednesday, a fence post she knew Bo had set solid and deep was leaning at a 45-degree angle. The dirt around the base was loose, dug out, not by water, not by an animal, by someone with a shovel and the patience to do it in the dark. By Wednesday evening, Grace understood. This was not bad luck. This was not the tail end of the flood. Someone was doing this on purpose. Someone who came at night and left before dawn. Someone who wanted her to look at her broken fences and her poisoned water and her wandering cattle and decide it was not worth the fight. Grace did not scare. Grace got angry. She saddled the brown gelding Thursday morning before dawn. Bo was at the far end of the upper pasture, splicing wire. She did not tell him where she was going. This was her fight, her land, her problem. She had handled everything alone for 3 years, and she would handle this too. It was 8 miles to Burr Oak. She rode hard and reached town by mid-morning. The marshal's office was a low building on the main street, sandwiched between the feed store and the barber shop. A sign above the door read, Town Marshal, Virgil Hale. Virgil was inside, a man of 60 with a gut that hung over his belt and eyes that had gone tired a long time ago. He was drinking coffee and reading a week-old newspaper when Grace walked in. She told him everything. The cut fences, the poisoned water, the cattle let loose, the Miller fire to the south and the 3 homesteads that had sold to Dawson in 2 years. She laid it out plain, no emotion, just facts. The facts were enough. Virgil listened, nodded, set down his coffee. I will look into it, he said. Grace looked at him, looked at his tired eyes and his soft hands and the badge on his chest that had gone dull from lack of polishing. She saw the truth there. He would not look into anything. He knew exactly what was happening, and he had decided a long time ago that it was not his business to stop it. She stood up. Thank you for your time, Marshal. She kept her voice even. Walked out. Lena Marsh caught her on the sidewalk outside the general store. The older woman grabbed Grace's arm and pulled her into the store, past the counter, through the curtain, into the back room where the stock was kept. I heard you went to Virgil, Lena said. Her voice was low, urgent. Word travels fast, Grace said. It is a small town. Listen to me. Dawson bought 3 homesteads in 2 years. You are the last one standing between his ranch and the river crossing. He needs your land to drive his cattle south. Without it, he has to go 20 miles around. I know, Grace said. Then you know he is not going to stop. Lena leaned closer. And Grace, that man working your place, Dawson has been asking about him. More than once. Asking where he came from, how long he has been at your place, what his name is. Grace felt something cold move through her chest. What did you tell him? Nothing. I do not know anything to tell. But Dawson keeps asking, and Hank Dawson does not ask questions he does not already have answers to. Grace was walking out of the store when she saw the boy. He was standing by the horse trough across the street, filling a bottle with liniment from a jar. 17 or so, thin, dark-haired. He looked up when Grace passed and their eyes met. She knew his face, the jaw, the shape of the eyes. He looked like a younger version of Hank Dawson, though softer, less finished. You are Dawson's boy, Grace said. It was not a question. The boy looked at his boots. Emmett, he said. Emmett Dawson. Grace started to walk on. Then the boy spoke again, quietly, like he was not sure he should. My pa was not always like this. Grace stopped, turned back. Emmett was looking at the ground, turning the liniment bottle in his hands. Before Uncle Silas died, he was different. He used to take me fishing, used to laugh, used to. He stopped, swallowed. He was a good man once. Before. He looked up at Grace. His eyes were wet. Then he turned and walked away. Grace stood there on the sidewalk for a long time, watching the boy disappear down the street. She thought about what he had said, about a man who used to be good, about what grief could do to a person. Twist them, hollow them out, fill the empty spaces with something dark. She knew about that. She had been close to it herself. Then she did the things she should not have done. Instead of riding back to the farm and telling Bo what she had learned, instead of sitting down with him and making a plan, instead of trusting the man who had stayed when everyone else rode past, Grace Holloway did what she had done every day for 3 years. She handled it alone. She rode straight to Dawson's ranch. It was a big spread. White fences, red barn, a house that was twice the size of anything else in the county, with glass windows and a real porch with turned railings. a place built by a man who wanted people to know he had money. Grace tied her horse to the rail and walked up the steps, knocked on the door. Dawson opened it himself. He was in his shirt sleeves, a glass of whiskey in one hand. He looked at Grace standing on his porch, mud on her boots, fury in her eyes, and he smiled. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "what a pleasant surprise. Come in. Can I offer you some refreshment?" Grace did not go in. She stood on his porch and told him she knew what he was doing. The fences, the water, the cattle, the Miller fire. She told him she was not selling and she was not leaving, and if one more thing happened on her property, she would ride to the state capitol and file a complaint with the governor's office. Dawson listened to all of it. He leaned against the doorframe and sipped his whiskey and let her talk. When she was finished, he nodded, slow, thoughtful, like he was considering her words very carefully. Then he said, almost gently, like a man delivering bad news to a friend, "You know who is living under your roof, Mrs. Holloway?" Grace went still. "The man who killed my brother. Shot him dead over a piece of dirt in Missouri. His real name is Elijah Kane. There is a warrant out. Has been for 5 years. Dawson took a sip of whiskey. His eyes never left her face. "You let a murderer into your home, into your life, and you come here to talk to me about cut fences." Grace's hands were shaking. She pushed them into the folds of her skirt so he would not see. "My brother Silas was 27 years old," Dawson said. His voice had changed. The smooth politician was gone. What was underneath was older, rawer. He was going to be married that spring. Girl named Ruth from over in Lawrence. He had bought a new suit for the wedding. It was still hanging in his closet when they buried him. Dawson finished his whiskey, set the glass on the rail. "So you go on home, Mrs. Holloway, and you ask that man what his real name is. You ask him about Silas. Then you tell me about cut fences." Grace rode home in silence. 8 miles of flat Kansas road, and not a single thought that held still long enough to examine. Her mind was a war. Dawson was a liar and a bully, and a cheat. But the name, Elijah Kane, had landed with the weight of truth. She saw it in Dawson's eyes when he talked about his brother. That was not a bluff. That was grief. She walked into the cabin. Bo was at the table, coiling wire. He looked up, saw her face. Everything in the room went still, the fire in the stove, the light through the window, the dust in the air. "What is your real name?" Grace asked. Her voice was ice. Everything stopped. The first kiss tasted like coffee and desperation, because Bo Ryder knew it might be the last thing Grace Holloway ever gave him. But the kiss came first, before the confrontation, before the truth came out and burned everything down. It came in the morning of the day Grace rode to Dawson's ranch, before Bo knew what she was about to do, and before she knew what he was hiding. It came like this. Bo woke in the dark, not the cabin dark, a different dark, the dark of memory, the dark of Missouri in the summer of 1873. A dirt road outside Independence, July heat so thick it had weight. Silas Dawson standing at the fence line of what used to be the Kane family farm, a deed in one hand, a pistol in the other. The deed was legal. Bo knew that even then. His mother had died owing money. Consumption and debt, the twin plagues of the frontier. Silas Dawson had bought the debt, and with it the land. "This land is mine now, boy. Legal. Your ma died owing money and I bought the debt." Bo's hands shaking. Not from fear, from something worse. From the knowledge that every word was true. "That is my mother's house." Silas raised the pistol. Was. The shot came before Bo thought. His own gun. When did he draw it? He could not remember drawing it. Could not remember the decision. Just the sound. The kick. The smell of powder. And Silas Dawson on the ground. Blood in the dirt. The deed fluttering down beside him. A suit receipt in his vest pocket, Bo would learn later. for a wedding that would never happen. And Bo standing there holding a smoking revolver, already knowing he would never stop running. He woke, drenched in sweat, dawn light gray through the window. Grace was asleep beside him. Not beside him in the bed, on her pallet by the stove, but close. Close enough that he could hear her breathing. Steady, peaceful. The breathing of a woman who had fallen asleep knowing someone would still be there come morning. The distance between her sleeping peace and his waking horror. That was the whole story of his life in one image. He got up, went outside. The morning was cold and clear. He stood on the porch and breathed until his hands stopped shaking. Grace came out a while later, 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. Their fingers touched on the cup. Neither pulled away. Something had shifted between them. Not last night, not in any single moment. It had been shifting for days, slow as the creek finding its way back into its channel. The way she left the door open when he was outside, so the lamplight could reach him. The way he set her tools in a line on the shelf, handle side out, the way she liked them. The small courtesies of people learning each other's shape. Grace turned to face him. She put her hand on his chest, flat, over his heart. He could feel the warmth of her palm through his shirt, the pressure of her fingers. He stood still. Every part of him said, run. Every part of him said, you do not deserve this. Every part of him said, you are going to ruin her the way you ruin everything. He leaned down and kissed her, slow, trembling, both of them scared. Her lips were dry and tasted like coffee. His stubble scraped her chin. It was not graceful. It was not smooth. It was 2 people who had forgotten how to do this, or maybe never learned properly in the first place, finding their way by touch and hope. Grace pulled back, looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying, more like something had thawed. Bo, she said, his borrowed name on her lips. Grace, he said, her real name on his. They did not say anything else, just stood there on the porch, with their coffee getting cold, and the morning getting bright around them. And for one moment the world was quiet and good, and neither of them was running or waiting or counting what they had left. That was the morning of the kiss. By evening, everything was different. Grace rode to Dawson's ranch that afternoon while Bo was working the far fence line. He did not know she had gone until he came back for supper and found the cabin empty. The stove cold, no lamp in the window. Her horse gone. He waited on the porch. An hour, 2. The sun dropped toward the horizon and painted the prairie gold and orange, but Bo did not see it. He saw only the empty road and the darkening sky, and the place inside his chest where something had started to grow that morning, and was now being crushed by the weight of what he knew was coming. She came back at dusk, rode into the yard at a walk, dismounted, tied the horse to the rail. Her movements were stiff, mechanical. She walked past him into the cabin without speaking. Bo followed her inside. She was standing by the table, her back to him, her hands flat on the scarred wood where they had eaten breakfast that morning, where they had shared coffee and cornbread, and something that might have been happiness if either of them had been brave enough to call it that. She turned around. "What is your real name?" Her voice was ice, her eyes were worse. Bo felt it hit him like a physical blow. Not surprise. He had been waiting for this moment for 5 years. Every town, every job, every time he got close enough to someone for it to matter. He had been waiting for the look that was on Grace Holloway's face right now. He pulled out the chair, sat down, put his hands flat on the table, the way Grace had a moment before, so she could see them, so there was nothing hidden. "Elijah Kane," he said. Grace did not sit. She stood over him, arms crossed, jaw tight. He told her everything, the farm in Missouri, his mother's death, the debt, Silas Dawson buying the land, the confrontation at the fence line, the pistol, the shot. "He drew first," Bo said. "I believe that. But there was no one alive who saw it." So my believing it does not mean a damn thing. He told her about running. 5 years of moving before anyone could get close. 5 years of leaving before anyone could leave him. 5 years of borrowed names and temporary work and sleeping with one hand on his saddlebag in case he needed to be gone before dawn. He told her about the poster, about seeing it in bur oak with fresh tacks in the wood, about the boy nailing it up, about walking into the store and hearing Dawson's name, and knowing in that moment exactly whose brother he had killed. Grace listened to all of it. Her face did not change, not once. When he finished, the silence lasted a long time, long enough for the last light to leave the window, long enough for the cabin to go dark except for the coals in the stove. Then Grace spoke. "You knew his name. You knew who Dawson was the day you rode into town. You knew what he had done to the homesteaders around here. You knew he was dangerous, and you came back here anyway." She unfolded her arms, put her hands flat on the table, leaned forward until her face was close to his. "You brought that war to my door, and you did not say a word." "Grace," Bo started. "Get out of my house," she said. She did not raise her voice, did not need to. The words hit harder for being quiet, for being said in the same level tone she used to talk to a spooked animal. Calm, certain, done. She went outside, untied Bo's mare from the porch rail, led her to the gate. Then she took the rope. The same rope that had torn her hands in the floodwater on the first day, the day Bo had appeared on the ridge and said 5 words that changed everything. She tied it across the gate. A closed door, a line drawn. Bo walked out of the cabin, across the yard, to the gate where his horse stood on the other side of that rope. He did not argue, did not plead, did not explain further. He had learned a long time ago that there was no point in fighting someone else's decision about you. People decided who you were, and that was that. He untied the rope from the gate post, led the mare through, and retied it behind him, closing the gate himself, accepting it. He swung up into the saddle, gathered the reins. Grace stood on the porch, arms at her sides, face unreadable in the fading light. Bo touched his hat brim, a gesture of respect, of goodbye, of something he could not name. Then he turned the mare west and rode away. He did not look back, because if he looked back, he would stop. And if he stopped, he would stay. And if he stayed, he would only bring her more trouble than he already had. Grace stood at the window and watched until the sorrel disappeared below the ridge line. Then she sat down at the table, looked at the 2 cups, picked one up, put it back on the shelf, same as she had done 3 years ago after the last neighbor left the funeral. The motion came back so easily it made her sick. 3 shadows fell across the cabin yard before Grace heard the hoofbeats. She put her hand on Thomas's rifle leaning by the door. Then she recognized the man on the black horse leading the way. Hank Dawson. And he was smiling. 2 men rode behind him. Hired hands, big, armed. Not the kind of men you bring to a neighborly visit. Grace stepped onto the porch. She did not bring the rifle, not yet, but she left the door open behind her. Dawson dismounted in the yard, took his time about it, adjusted his hat, tugged his vest straight. A man who wanted her to watch him and feel how unhurried he was, how comfortable, how certain. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I hope I am not intruding." "You are," Grace said, "but say your piece." Dawson reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded paper, held it up so she could see it was official. Printed letterhead, county seal at the top. "I have been patient, Mrs. Holloway, more patient than most men would be. I have offered you a fair price for this land 3 times now. Each time you have refused." He unfolded the paper. It was a petition, filed with the county, her husband's name at the top. "Thomas Holloway has been deceased 3 years, Dawson said. The land has not been worked to standard. No barn, no adequate shelter for livestock, no crop in the ground. Under the terms of the Homestead Act, that constitutes abandonment. I have filed a petition to have the claim declared void. A judge will sign it by month's end." He held the paper out to her. She did not take it. "Or," Dawson continued, his voice dropping to something that was meant to sound kind but landed like a threat, "you can sign this." He pulled a second paper from his coat. "A bill of sale. I am offering $300. That is more than fair. Enough for a train ticket east and a room in a boarding house until you figure out what comes next." Grace looked at the bill of sale, at Dawson's face, at the two armed men behind him. "No," she said. Dawson's smile dimmed. "Not much. Just enough to show what was behind it. Mrs. Holloway, winter is coming. You have no barn, no hay, no hired man anymore. I hear he rode out." She saw the satisfaction in his eyes when he said that. "A woman alone with 28 head and no feed. That is not brave. That is just sad. I said no." "You have 3 days," Dawson said. The smile was gone now. His voice was flat, hard, the real man under the polished surface. "After that, the petition goes to the judge, and I will have this land, one way or another." He turned to mount his horse, then stopped, looked back at her over his shoulder. "Best save what is yours, Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Sign the paper." Same words, same 5 words Bo had said in the floodwater, but in Dawson's mouth they were twisted. Corrupted, turned into a weapon. Grace felt them land like a slap. Dawson rode out. His men followed. The sound of hoofbeats faded down the slope and into the valley. Then silence. Grace went inside, closed the door, leaned against it. The cabin was empty. The stove was cold. There was no coffee on the shelf because they had finished the last of it 2 days ago and Bo was gone and there was no one to ride to town for more. She sat at the table, looked at the envelope, Bo's handwriting, the list, the word we. She thought about selling, really thought about it for the first time, packing a bag, getting on a train, going east, becoming someone else in some city where no one knew her name and no one would ever notice if she disappeared. The thought sat there, heavy and real. She could taste it. The relief of giving up, of not fighting anymore, of setting down a weight she had been carrying so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Then her eyes fell on the poster, still lying on the table where she had left it. Elijah Kane, murder. Silas Dawson, $200 reward. She picked it up, read it again, looked at the sketch. The face. It was Bo, and it was not Bo. It was a younger man, harder, with something desperate in his eyes. The artist had drawn a killer. What Grace saw was something different. A man carrying a weight he did not deserve. A man who could not stop running because no one had ever given him a reason to stop. Same as her, different direction. She stood still, and he kept moving. She stopped expecting anyone to come, and he stopped letting anyone get close. But the wound underneath was the same. The fear of being left, the shame of having waited. And she had done to him exactly what everyone had done to her. She had sent him away. She had looked at his worst secret and decided it was all he was. She had closed the gate and tied the rope and put away the second cup and gone back to being alone, because alone was safe. Alone was familiar. Alone was the one thing she knew how to do. Grace put the poster down. She had not thrown Bo out because of what he did in Missouri. She had thrown him out because he did not trust her with it. And she had ridden to Dawson's ranch alone because she did not trust Bo with her fight. Same flaw, same fear. They were mirrors of each other. Grace stood up. She was done. Not done fighting. Done being alone while she did it. She saddled the gelding and rode to town. Not to the marshal's office. To Lena Marsh's store. She told Lena everything. Dawson's petition, the abandonment clause, the threat. Lena listened with her jaw getting tighter and tighter. "Show me your papers," Lena said. Grace had brought them. The homestead filing, the deed, the proof of claim. She spread them out on Lena's counter. It was Lena who found it. Halfway down the second page of the homestead filing, in Thomas Holloway's careful handwriting, Grace's name, listed as co-owner. Thomas had added her when he submitted the claim. Grace stared at it. She had not known. Thomas had never told her. Maybe he had meant to, and the winter fever came first. "This means the abandonment clause does not apply," Lena said. "You are the co-owner. You have been working this land every day for 3 years. No judge in Kansas will call that abandonment." Grace folded the papers, put them in her coat, looked at Lena. "Thank you," she said. Lena reached across the counter and took Grace's hand, squeezed it. "You should have come to me years ago," Lena said. "You should not have been alone out there." Grace shook her head. "I did not think anyone was left who cared." Lena's eyes were fierce. "I wrote you a letter, Grace. 2 years ago. I wrote you and told you my door was always open. You never wrote back. I thought you did not want help." "I never got any letter," Grace said. They looked at each other, and in the silence between them, a new piece of the puzzle fell into place. A letter written and never received. A woman isolated and left to think she had been forgotten, not by accident, by design. Grace rode home in the dark. She did not sleep that night. She lay on her pallet by the cold stove and stared at the ceiling, counted the beams, 7 across. She had counted them 1,000 times. When dawn came, she did not pack a bag, did not fold a dress into a trunk. She took Thomas's rifle down from the wall, wiped it clean, loaded it. Not because she planned to shoot anyone, because she was done being the woman people forgot. Bo Ryder had been riding west for 2 days when he stopped his mare in the middle of an empty prairie. He looked down at his hands and realized they were shaking, not from cold, not from hunger, because for the first time in 5 years, they remembered what it felt like to belong somewhere. The mare stood patient beneath him. She was a good horse, steady. She had carried him across 6 states and never once complained. She went where he pointed her and did not ask why, which was more than he could say for himself. The prairie stretched flat in every direction, brown grass under a white sky. Nothing on the horizon, no fences, no buildings, no smoke, nothing to ride toward and nothing to ride away from. He had been here before, not this exact place, but this exact moment, the moment after leaving, the empty space that opened up behind him every time he rode away from somewhere that had started to feel like it could matter. He had ridden away from 17 places in 5 years, cow camps and ranches and line shacks and one boarding house in Wichita, where the woman who owned it had made him coffee every morning and asked about his day, and once, just once, touched his hand across the table. He had left the next morning, before dawn, without paying, without a word, without a... That was the pattern. Get close, feel something, run. He stopped at a relay station that night. An old stockman was sitting by the fire, warming his hands. Gray beard, bent back. The kind of man who had spent 50 years in the saddle and had nothing left to show for it except the saddle. The old man looked at Bo for a long time, then said, "You look like a man who just lost his place." Bo sat down by the fire. "I walked away from it," he said. The old man poked the coals with a stick. "Then you are a damn fool," he said. Bo thought about Grace's words, the ones she had said on the porch that night before the kiss, before everything went wrong. "You keep moving, so you cannot be left." I stopped expecting anyone to come, so I could not be disappointed. She had broken her pattern. She had trusted him, let him in, set out 2 cups, and he had done what he always did. He ran. No. That was not right either. She had thrown him out. She had tied the rope across the gate. But she had thrown him out because he had not trusted her with the truth. And if he was honest with himself, truly honest, he had kept the secret because some part of him had been waiting for exactly this, waiting for the excuse to leave. Because leaving was easier than staying. Leaving was the one thing he knew how to do. The old stockman was right. He was a damn fool. Bo turned the mare east at dawn. He rode hard for Dodge City. 30 miles south of the route back to Burr Oak. He needed to do something first, something he should have done 5 years ago. The United States Marshal's office in Dodge City was a two-room building next to the freight depot. A deputy marshal sat behind a desk stacked with papers. Young man, clean-shaved, badge pinned to his vest. Bo took off his hat, stood in front of the desk. "My name is Elijah Kane," he said. "I am wanted for the killing of Silas Dawson in Jackson County, Missouri in 1873. I am here to surrender myself." The deputy looked at him, picked up a pen, put it down, picked it up again. "Sit down," he said. Bo sat. The deputy went to a cabinet in the corner, pulled open a drawer, rifled through files, found something, read it again, looked up at Bo with an expression Bo could not read. "There has been a development," the deputy said. "A man named Hiram Potts, neighbor, lived a quarter-mile from the Dawson property. He filed a sworn statement 6 months ago testifying that Silas Dawson drew his weapon first, that you fired in self-defense." Bo sat very still. Hiram Potts. He remembered the name. Old man, kept chickens, lived up the road from the farm. Bo had not known he was there that day, had not known anyone was. "The warrant is under review," the deputy said. "Not dismissed yet, but the wheels are turning. Based on Potts's statement and your voluntary surrender, I can issue a receipt confirming your cooperation. You are free to go for now. Do not leave the territory." The deputy wrote out a receipt, signed it, stamped it, handed it to Bo along with a copy of Hiram Potts's sworn statement. Bo walked out of the marshal's office into the Dodge City sunlight. He stood on the boardwalk and read the statement twice. Then he folded it, put it in his coat pocket next to the wanted poster he had carried for 5 years. 2 pieces of paper, one that said he was a killer, one that said he might not be. The weight of them was the same. He rode east, hard. 2 days back to Burr Oak. 300 miles to the east on a porch in Kansas, Grace Holloway was standing her ground. Day 3. Dawson arrived precisely on schedule. This time he brought Virgil Hale and a stack of legal papers. 2 hired men on horseback behind them. But Grace was ready. She stood on the porch with Lena Marsh beside her. 2 women, one with a stack of papers, the other with a face that dared anyone to start something. Grace held up the homestead filing. "My name is on this land, Mr. Dawson," she said. Her voice was steady. "Has been since the day Thomas filed it. I have worked this ground every day for 3 years. No judge in Kansas will call that abandonment." Virgil took the papers, read them, looked up at Dawson. "Papers are in order, Hank," he said. "Quiet, tired, but clear. She is the legal owner." The change in Dawson was not sudden. It was like watching a river erode a bank. The polished surface crumbled piece by piece. The pleasant smile, the calm voice, the reasonable demeanor. All of it fell away until what stood in Grace's yard was not a county commissioner, not a powerful rancher, just a man. A grieving, furious, broken man. "I will have this land," Dawson said. "One way or another." Everyone heard it. Virgil heard it. Lena heard it. The hired men heard it and exchanged a look that said they had not signed up for this. Dawson mounted his horse. His men followed. They rode out in a line, dust rising behind them. But one horse stopped. Emmett Dawson separated from the group, turned his horse. Rode back to Grace's porch alone. His face was white. His hands were shaking on the reins. He dismounted, stood there, looked at Grace with eyes that were too old for 17. "My pa is coming back tonight," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "After dark. He is going to burn the upper pasture, the dry grass. It will take the whole hillside." Grace looked at him, at this boy standing against his own father. Emmett reached into his coat and pulled out a folded letter. Yellowed, creased from being carried a long time. He held it out to Grace. "He took this from the post office before it was delivered," Emmett said. "He has been doing it to all of them. The Millers, the Carpenters, the Wainwrights, cutting people off so they would feel alone enough to sell." Grace took the letter. She recognized the handwriting on the front. Lena Marsh's careful script, addressed to her, dated 2 years ago. Grace opened it, read it. Dear Grace, I think about you often. I hope you are not alone out there. If you ever need anything, my door is open. You are never forgotten. Lena. Grace folded the letter, put it in her pocket, over her heart. She looked at Emmett, a boy who had carried that letter for a year, trying to decide what to do with it, what kind of person to be. And in the end, he had chosen to be the kind who could look his father in the eye and say no more. Thank you, Grace said. Emmett nodded, did not speak, turned and rode away without looking back. The dust from his horse settled slow in the evening air. Grace stood on the porch as the sun dropped. She had the rifle by the door, the homestead papers in her coat, the letter in her pocket. And in her eyes, when she looked toward the western horizon, something that was not hope exactly, something quieter, readiness. The light was fading, orange to pink to deep red, purple, creeping in at the edges. Then she saw it. On the ridgeline, a silhouette, a rider on a sorrel mare, just sitting there, the way he had sat on that first day, in the rain, before everything began. Grace's heart hammered. Her hand went to the porch rail. The rider started down the slope, slow, steady, not rushing, not hesitating. The rope was still tied across the gate where Grace had put it the day she told Bo to leave. He rode up to it and stopped, did not untie it, did not dismount, just sat there on his mare in the fading light, waiting for her to decide. Grace walked down from the porch. Her boots left prints in the drying mud. She reached the gate. Her hand found the knot. And for the first time in her life, opening a door scared her more than keeping it shut. She pulled the rope free. Bo Ryder rode into the Holloway yard at dusk, and the first thing he saw was Grace Holloway sitting on the porch with a rifle across her knees. Not pointed at him, but not set aside either. He dismounted at the open gate. The rope hung loose where Grace had untied it. He walked into the yard, stopped at the porch steps. I came back, he said. I see that. Silence. The kind that has weight. The kind that fills the space between two people who have things to say but have not figured out where to start. Dawson is coming tonight, Grace said. He is going to burn the grass. I know. That is why I am here. Grace looked at him. Hard. Measuring. Last time you were here, you left. Bo reached into his coat, pulled out the papers from Dodge City. The deputy marshal's receipt, the pending warrant review, Hiram Potts's sworn statement. I went to the marshal's office in Dodge City, he said. Turned myself in. Gave my real name, Elijah Kane. He held the papers out to her. A man named Hiram Potts signed a statement. He was there that day. He saw Silas draw first. The warrant is under review. I am not running anymore. Grace took the papers, read them by the fading light. Potts's statement, the deputy's receipt. The official language of a system that moved slow but moved. She looked up at him. I want to stay here, Bo said, under my real name, if you will have me. Long silence. The last light was going, stars beginning to show in the east. Somewhere in the pasture a cow lowed. Grace stood up, leaned the rifle against the wall, not putting it away, just setting it down. There is coffee, she said. Come inside. They had 2 hours before full dark. They used them. Grace told Bo about Emmett, about the letter, about Dawson's plan to burn the pasture. Bo told Grace about Dodge City, about Potts, about the warrant. Then they made a plan. The first plan they had ever made together, not Grace handling it alone, not Bo keeping secrets. Both of them at the table with the envelope between them and the pencil stub and the list that now had both their handwriting on it. Grace rode to town one more time that evening. She found Lena and Lena found Virgil. She brought Emmett's testimony about the letter interceptions. She brought the physical evidence of the letter itself. She brought the word arson, spoken by Dawson's own son. Virgil Hale listened. He looked at the letter, at the testimony, at Lena Marsh standing behind Grace with her arms crossed and her jaw set. And for the first time in years, the tired old marshal straightened his back. "I will be at your place tonight," Virgil said, with a deputy. Grace rode home in the dark. Bo was waiting on the porch. He had moved the cattle to the far end of the upper pasture, away from the south-facing slope where the dry grass was thickest. He had cleared a strip of brush along the fence line, creating a break. They did not talk much. Did not need to. Bo took position at the western fence line where the land dropped away toward the creek bed. Grace stayed on the porch, the rifle across her lap. Virgil and his deputy were positioned on the road, out of sight. They waited. Full dark came slow. The stars were out. No moon, the kind of darkness that made the prairie feel like the bottom of the ocean. Grace heard them before she saw them. Hoofbeats from the south. 3 riders, moving fast. Then the first torch lit up, a bloom of orange in the black, and she could see them. 3 men on horseback, pitch torches streaming fire. Dawson was in front. She knew his shape, the big shoulders, the way he sat a horse. He threw the first torch himself, a long, arcing throw. The pitch torch tumbled through the air and landed in the dry autumn grass of the upper pasture. The flames caught fast, faster than Grace expected. The grass was tinder dry from weeks without rain after the flood. Orange light rolled across the hillside like something alive. The cattle started bawling. She could hear them bunching and shoving in the dark, panicking. Dawson threw a second torch, a third. The fire spread in a widening crescent. Climbing the hill, reaching toward the fence line, toward the lean-to, toward the herd. On the road, Virgil moved. He and the deputy rode out of the dark with their badges catching the firelight. The 2 hired men saw them, looked at each other, and dropped their torches. Put their hands up without a word. They were hired for intimidation, not for a fight. But Dawson kept going. He rode along the fire line, lighting more grass, spreading the flames wider. He did not look back, did not see Virgil, or did not care. Bo stepped out of the darkness at the western fence line, directly in Dawson's path. The firelight caught both their faces, orange and black, shadow and flame. The man who killed Silas Dawson and the brother who had spent 5 years turning his grief into a weapon. Dawson pulled up his horse, hard. The animal danced sideways, snorting, eyes rolling at the fire. "Elijah Kane," Dawson said. His voice was strange, almost relieved, like a man who had been waiting 5 years for exactly this, and was almost glad it was finally here. "That is right," Bo said. And Silas drew first. "There is a witness now. Hiram Potts signed a statement in Missouri. Your warrant is dead, Dawson, and so is this." Dawson's hand moved toward his hip. Slow, not fast, not a draw, more like a reflex. The movement of a man who had been reaching for that gun in his mind for 5 years. Bo did not draw. He stood there, hands at his sides, the fire painting him orange. "Go ahead," Bo said. "But your boy is watching." Dawson turned. Emmett was standing 30 yards away near the road next to Virgil Hale. The firelight caught his face. Young, terrified, but not looking away. Not this time. The fight went out of Hank Dawson, not all at once. It drained slow like water from a cracked jar. His hand dropped. His shoulders dropped. His face dropped. What was left was not a powerful man, not a dangerous man, just a man standing in the light of a fire he had set, with his son watching him and no more lies to tell. Virgil moved in. His voice was steady, calm, the voice of a man doing his job for the first time in a long time. "Hank Dawson, you are under arrest for arson, criminal trespass, and interference with the United States mail. You will be held in the county jail pending trial." Dawson dismounted, handed his reins to the deputy. "Let Virgil take his sidearm." He went quiet, but before they led him away, he turned. Not to Virgil, not to Grace, not to his son, to Bo. "He was my brother," Dawson said. Bo nodded. "I know. I am sorry he is dead, but I am done paying for it." Dawson looked at him a moment longer. Then he turned and walked toward the road with Virgil beside him. Emmett stood still as his father passed. Their eyes met. Dawson opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then closed it, kept walking. Emmett watched him go. Then the boy turned away, mounted his horse, rode into the dark without a word. But the fire was still burning. The crescent of flame was climbing the hillside. The grass crackled and popped. Smoke rose thick and gray, lit orange from below. The cattle were bawling, bunching against the far fence, pressing into each other. Grace was already moving, off the porch, across the yard, into the smoke and the dark, toward the herd. Her boots kicked up ash. Sparks drifted around her like fireflies gone wrong. Bo followed. He grabbed the rope off the gate post as he ran, the same rope from the first day. The rope that had torn Grace's hands, the rope she had used to close the gate between them. Now they both held it. Together they drove the cattle away from the fire line, through the smoke, through the dark, coughing, eyes streaming, Grace on one side, Bo on the other, funneling the herd toward the high ground where the grass was still green and the air was still clean. The image of them in that moment. Two silhouettes against a wall of fire, driving cattle through the dark, backlit against a red-orange sky. 5 weeks ago, in the flood, Grace had done this alone, bleeding, freezing, certain that no one was coming. Now there were two of them, two voices shouting, two bodies working against the dark. Not one person drowning alone, two people fighting together. The fire burned to the fence line and stopped. The strip Bo had cleared of brush and grass acted as a fire break. The flames hit bare dirt and found nothing to feed on. They flickered, dimmed, died. The cattle were safe on the high ground. 28 head, all of them. Grace counted twice to be sure. Her face was black with soot. Her hands were shaking. Bo stood beside her, just as filthy, just as spent, breathing hard. The last embers were dying on the scorched hillside below. The smoke was thinning, drifting east on the night wind. They stood there for a long time, not touching, not speaking, just breathing, being alive, being here. Then Bo reached out and took her hand, the hand he had bandaged in the cabin that second morning, healed now, scarred, but whole. Grace took a breath, let it out slow. They walked up to the cabin together. Dawn came clear and golden. The pasture was scorched black on one side, green on the other. Smoke drifted in thin ribbons across the line where the fire had died. The air smelled like ash and wet earth, and the faint ghost of something already fading. Grace and Bo stood on the porch, filthy, exhausted, covered in soot and sweat and the smell of a long night. Grace spoke first. "You could leave any time. Road has been clear for weeks." Bo looked at her. "Road has been clear since October. I am still here. How long are you staying?" He looked at the farm, the fence he had mended, the lean-to he had built, the herd grazing on the unburned grass, the cabin behind them with the lamp still burning in the window. Then he looked at Grace, reached out, took her hand again, and, "Best save what is yours then," he said. Same 5 words. But everything was different now. What is yours did not mean cattle, did not mean land, did not mean the right to exist or the right to matter. It meant this. Here. Us. Grace laughed. The first real laugh in the entire story. Raw, surprised. A sound she almost did not recognize because it had been so long since she had heard herself make it. Her voice was rough from smoke and disuse and 3 years of silence. Then, "Come inside," she said. "There is coffee." He followed her through the door. The next morning, Grace woke to sunlight. clear, golden, pouring through the window like something spilled. She lay still for a moment, listening. From outside came the sound of hammer on nail, steady, rhythmic, each strike clean and true. Bo was out there, framing the new barn, building something that would stand. She got up, went to the kitchen, lit the stove. The kindling caught quick. She added split logs, filled the kettle with the cold water from the pitcher, set it on the stove to heat. She took down the coffee tin from the shelf. It was full. Bo had bought a whole pound in town 2 days ago. She measured it out. The smell filled the cabin, rich and dark and promising. She set 2 cups on the table, did not pause, did not stare at them, did not think about it. 2 cups. Of course 2. That was just how it was now. She walked to the shelf and took down the old envelope. The one Bo had written their first list on that very first morning when they sat at this table and he asked what needs fixing first. She turned it over. And on the front, beneath the crossed-out name, she saw what she had never noticed before. An address. Independence, Missouri. A farm. His mother's farm. The home he had lost. He had carried this envelope for 5 years, across 6 states, through 17 towns, through every night on the cold ground and every morning of riding west. It was the only proof he had ever belonged anywhere. And he had used the back of it to write a list of repairs for a stranger's farm. He had used it to write the word "we." Grace placed the envelope back on the shelf. This time, addressed side out. It did not need to be hidden anymore. She poured the coffee, carried both cups to the table, sat down and wrapped her hands around the warmth. Outside, the sound of hammer on nail continued, steady, rhythmic, the sound of building, of something being made instead of lost. Grace took a sip, burned her tongue, did not care. She stood up and went to the door, opened it. The morning was clear and cold and so bright it made her eyes water. Bo was across the yard, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, setting a corner post for the new barn frame. He looked up when the door opened, caught her eye, nodded once, then went back to work. The cattle grazed in the upper pasture, 28 head spread out across the green grass. The milk cow stood in her lean-to, chewing slow and peaceful. The creek ran clear below, back in its channel, catching the sunlight and throwing it back in bright flashes. The scorched ground where the fire had burned was already starting to show green at the edges, where new grass was pushing up through the ash. Grace sat on the top step. The autumn wind carried the smell of hay and clean earth and coffee from the cup in her hands. From across the yard, the hammer struck again, and again, steady as a heartbeat. She took a sip of coffee, closed her eyes. And for the first time in 3 years, Grace Holloway did not count what she had left. She just lived. There is something heavy about a story like this. Not sad, exactly, just heavy. The kind of weight that sits quiet in your chest when you think about all the years someone can go unseen. All the meals eaten alone. All the mornings waking up knowing nobody is coming. Grace and Bo were not rescued. They did not ride off into the sunset or strike gold or find some easy answer to the hard question of how 2 broken people make a life. They just stopped running, stopped waiting, found each other in the mud and the rain and the work that needed doing, decided that was enough. She saved her own farm. He turned himself in. Nobody fixed anybody. They just showed up, stayed, did the work. And somewhere in all that showing up and staying and doing, something mended, not healed. Not yet, maybe never completely, but mending, slow and sure like the land after the flood, like 2 people who had been forgotten, learning they were worth remembering after all. If you stayed through to the end of this, thank you. If you know what it is like to wait for a knock on the door that never comes, or to wonder if you matter enough for someone to notice you are still here, then you already know what this story is about. It is not a lesson. It is just what happened, and maybe that is all right. Maybe some stories do not need to be wrapped up neat or explained completely. Maybe they are just allowed to rest the way they are. quiet and unfinished and real. Thank you for listening. Leave a comment if this one stayed with you. And if you are out there somewhere waiting, know this: you are not forgot, not to us, not now.